Democrats and one particular Democratic organization is launching what they're referring to as a data-driven effort to recapture white voters who have stopped supporting the party for the past few years. Well, actually for several years now. Now, how do they plan to do it? By leaning into more talk about equity and race. Now, organizers say traditional methods in wooing white voters are ineffective, often relying on knee-jerk recommendations from an elite group of Democrats that pushes a race-neutral economic message. White Stripe organizers, that's the name of the organization here, say this approach is misguided. They are calling for a more targeted and data-driven approach that they argue will be a better return on investment. Now, before I continue, I really want to make a clear distinction here, okay? Because what this organization, White Stripe, is trying to do is specifically attract white voters who do not have college degrees, okay? They have flocked over to the right, and the Democratic Party really believes, you know what, we can get them back, we can get them back. Now, Erin Haney, who serves as the executive director of this organization, Showing Up for Racial Justice is the name of it, says courting white voters is critical if the Democrats want to win. And that makes sense. I mean, they're the majority of the population. She says that white voters have disproportionate political power. She told organizers in remarks during the Monday afternoon launch of the project, we need a strategy for engaging and organizing them alongside communities of color. Now, I don't think that's an impossible thing to do. I think you can totally do that. It's just the strategy they want to implement here. And to be quite honest, they're not very specific about how they intend on implementing this strategy. I just don't think it's gonna work. Now, according to Politico, Democratic activists are frustrated with the party's efforts to specifically target white voters with college degrees. And to be sure, the Democratic Party has increasingly attracted upper class white voters. Over the last 4 election cycles, for instance, white voters without college degrees have flocked to the right. Now, while Joe Biden performed better among the group of white voters without college degrees in 2020 compared to Hillary Clinton just 4 years earlier, Republicans still dominated. According to the Pew Research Center, Biden carried 33% of this bloc, while then President Donald Trump carried 65%. But there's a caveat. The caveat, according to Pew, was that the vote total Trump carried with non-college educated whites was nearly identical to what he pulled in 2016. So let's pause and understand what that means. So the argument here is, all right, Trump had the same amount of support from white voters without a college degree in 2020 as he did in 2016. Now, Biden managed to increase his support among white voters without a college degree, meaning that an increased number of white voters turned up to vote and they cast their ballots for Biden. So what they're trying to do here is encourage more of these voters who typically are non-voters to get out the vote and support Biden. Now, the White Stripe Project thinks that these white voters are gettable. And the way to attract them to the blue side of the aisle is to dive deeper into culture wars. That's literally what Steve Phillips, who's a longtime Democrat and a Democratic strategist, told Politico. He is described as a thought leader. Now, he says that far too often, Democrats and deep-pocketed donors settle on narratives about past elections that then inform future contests with little empirical data to back up those entrenched beliefs. Now, get a load of this. One of those narratives, he said, and other activists say, is the notion among the donor class that a focus on racial issues should be abandoned in favor of a more race-neutral message centered around the economy. What? Donors, you think donors are showing up to Democrats' offices and lobbying them to like focus on improving their material conditions? What? No, that's not what donors do. Donors like deregulation. They love their tax cuts. The last thing donors want is for our politicians to push for economic policies that improve the material conditions of everyone. That would mean more spending, which means more taxation, and possibly more regulation. Now, Politico mentions that Phillips is the chair of the Sander Phillips Center. So I was curious about that organization, never heard anything about them. So I did a little bit of digging to figure out what the organization is all about. Since Politico reported that the people behind the Project White Stripe, are progressives. Well, the organization is chaired by Susan Sandler, who on the group's website is described as follows: a philanthropist and political donor. She was the first and largest donor behind the independent efforts to support Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. She was also the lead investor in the independent activities supporting Kamala Harris's 2010 campaign for California Attorney General and Cory Booker's 2013 election to the United States Senate. So look, in other words, she has been supportive of the type of neoliberal Democrats who have emphasized identitarian and culture war politics in lieu of economic policy. Another person who thinks the White Stripe Project's electoral strategy is a good idea, though she's not part of it, is Liz Smith. Remember her? She was the senior advisor for Pete Buttigieg during the 2020 presidential election. But look, to her credit, she also notes that Democrats have been losing support among working class voters from all backgrounds. She says that Democrats have been underperforming generally with working class voters, whether they're white, Latino, or black. And that's an issue that we need to work on. But the solutions won't be found in turning our back on some of our most devoted voters. And I agree with her on that. Now, she's right, economic conditions have hurt the Democrats. Along with Latino voters, they have lost support among them. Let's take a look at what happened during the midterm elections.
While Latinos lean Democrat and prefer Democratic control of Congress, support for the GOP is up 10 points over 5 midterm cycles. It's why some are calling the Latino voter the sleeping giant.
Republicans figured out how to connect with Latino voters culturally. This is not about policy. This is about people's view of the country.
What are the issues that are on the minds of voters right now in this district?
Inflation, gas prices, good jobs. Number one is like, la cosa está muy mala. Things are really bad.
Inflation, gas prices, good jobs. When people tell you who they are and what they want, you have to listen to them. Just laid out for you right there. Now, the Associated Press reported in June that Democratic candidates won 57% of Hispanic voters during last year's midterms, a smaller percentage than the 63% of Hispanic voters Biden won in 2020, and the 66% of Hispanic voters supporting the party in 2018 when Democrats took control of the House, according to an Associated Press VoteCast, a sweeping survey of the national electorate. Meanwhile, 39% of Hispanic voters backed Republicans last year, a tick up from the 35% who supported former President Donald Trump's re-election bid. And as we shared with you earlier this week, the Democrats are also experiencing less support among young black male voters as well. Black voter turnout overall dropped by 10% in last year's midterms compared to 2018. Now, Brittany Smith, who's the executive director of the Philadelphia-based Black Leadership PAC, told the Washington Post that, quote, when you think about election cycle to election cycle, black voters have been telling us for a long time what matters. They want to put food on the table, a roof over their heads, send kids to good schools, live in neighborhoods that are safe. I don't think the issues are new. It's the way we talk about them and the way we're centering the voice of the people who live in these communities. So look, considering how much the Democrats have hyper-focused on identitarianism and pro-corporate neoliberal policies, how exactly does the White Stripe Project think that using better data is going to make this failed tactic work in the future? It's like coming across a burning building and deciding that pouring more lighter fluid on it will put out the blaze, as long as you have some statistical data telling you that lighter fluid works. Now, universal and race-neutral economic policy would have broader appeal among the electorate. In fact, the push for universal economic policies that emphasize the diversity of the working class is really the only way I see Democrats implementing a successful strategy here. Focusing on class does not mean that you abandon marginalized communities. Class politics is the most intersectional type of politics in America. Marginalized communities are overrepresented in the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. Black and Hispanic workers are disproportionately employed in minimum wage jobs. In fact, let's take a look at the numbers. So 31.3% of Black workers and 30.7% of Hispanic workers would receive a raise if the minimum wage was raised to $15 per hour. If you want to compare that to white people, 18.4% of white American workers would also see a pay raise if the minimum wage was lifted, meaning that Black and Hispanic Americans are disproportionately affected by these lower wages. But you get more support for a policy if it universally benefits people. If you try to sell something as a policy that only benefits one group based on what that one group's identity is, it's gonna be harder to pass it. You guys get what I'm saying? Now, student loan debt relief, another example. That would be a universal economic policy. It's not based on race or gender, right? It benefits all borrowers. However, Black borrowers are disproportionately burdened by student loan debt. As of 2019, a typical Black student loan borrower will still owe 95% of loans 20 years after starting college, compared to only 6% for a white borrower. Now, a single-payer healthcare system would also be universal, and marginalized communities stand to benefit from it the most. Look, I'm gonna give you one example, and I think this is super important. Members of the transgender community who have chosen to transition will need medical attention for the rest of their lives, which is a path to financial hardship and bankruptcy given our broken healthcare system. On the other hand, identity politics, which highlights our immutable differences and front loads these characteristics in Democratic campaigning, divides us. The culture wars distract from what binds us together as workers. It encourages members of different races, sexes, sexual identities, and religious beliefs to fight for the scraps left behind by the elite who successfully pit us against one another. It conditions us to celebrate the tokenization of marginalized groups in government roles and corporate boards, knowing that these acts do little to improve the lives of anyone other than those symbols of false progress. And as the rich hoard even more wealth, the political left, in my opinion, delude themselves into thinking they're fighting for justice and equality. In reality, organizing labor becomes more difficult because we're all conditioned to think that our personal identity is the most important thing in the world, and that any of our peers who disagree with us should be shamed and treated as outcasts. Apparently, the Biden campaign, though, has caught on to how important it is to center economic messaging while also discussing how these politics benefit marginalized communities. Biden plans to visit Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's district in Georgia for the groundbreaking of a new solar facility. And he released a campaign ad using video of Greene's own speech, talking about Bidenomics and comparing him to Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lyndon B. Johnson.
Joe Biden had the largest public investment in social infrastructure and environmental programs that is actually finishing what FDR started, that LBJ expanded on, and Joe Biden is attempting to complete programs to address education, medical care, urban problems, rural poverty, transportation, Medicare, Medicaid, labor unions, and he still is working on it.
I just love that Marjorie Greene listed those things as if they're unpopular. And She really thought she was taking some digs at Biden there. But good job for the Biden campaign, basically using that to their advantage. And look, honestly, I think comparing Biden to FDR or LBJ is kind of laughable. But at least he seems to understand how popular those presidents were. One of them created Social Security, the other Medicare. These are two wildly popular and universal social programs that materially improved people's lives. That's how you win.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.